Have you ever been hungry and gone shopping? What do you buy? Pretty much everything in the shop. And that's exactly what's happened to China post-global financial crisis. Except for you are China's industry and the bank is the shops. So let's figure out what happened here. Thanks to Michael for posting this question on my wall. He's linked to an article from the ABC and he's asked the question, if I'm reading this right, China is lending itself a large amount of money that it doesn't have and more importantly that its banks don't have. Is this right? Yep, that's pretty much exactly what's happening, but it's a little bit more complex than that. You see, at the moment, China's banks are facing about 8 trillion renminbi in losses. That's about $1.7 trillion Australian, which to put this into perspective, that's the entire GDP of Australia. Can you imagine if every single person in Australia went to work for an entire year and we took all that money and poured it down a big hole? That's exactly the size of the losses that China is facing at the moment. China's non-financial debt grew by more than 15% last year to a total of 250% of their GDP. More than 1/4 of Chinese state-owned firms are loss-making. About 40% of new credit goes towards financing interest on old loans. This essentially means that the stockpile of debt is growing exponentially. They're running, but not fast enough to keep up. China could lose as much as half of its banking capital if a crisis ensues. So China has a big banking problem, and while every banking and financial crisis has debt involved, the causes are always slightly different. So let's go back to 2008 during the global financial crisis, which is the origin of this story. China's government decided to spend up big to bolster the economy. The real problem here is that they haven't actually stopped the spending. The Chinese government poured 4 trillion renminbi into GFC stimulus, and this went to things such as building roads or building new steel factories, building new capacity. This inherently makes sense. While the demand for exports is suppressed, you pump up investment and that pumps up the economy for now. That gives you demand for industrial goods now and it also gives you capacity into the future. But herein lies the problem. Today they have excess industrial capacity. They're now suffering deflation, and the worst part about it is that some of these loans are starting to go very, very bad. In the rush to spend, managers did not always invest in the best projects. To make matters worse here, the Chinese state-owned enterprises, they are not really separate of the government per se. You see, there's this theory of corporate governance that maintains that there are some countries that are insider systems or outsider systems. English-speaking countries tend to be outsider systems or shareholder-based systems. You see, if you run a big business and you need the money, you're going to have to go to someone outside, someone who's going to give you the capital to run your business in the first place. But there are other countries that are stakeholder or insider systems, China being one. These stakeholder systems rely on 3 sources of capital: banks, the government, and family. Bank-driven systems include countries such as Germany. Government sources of finance include countries such as Malaysia, Norway, and China. And family-driven systems are also seen in countries such as Italy and India. So it's common knowledge that state-owned enterprises are a really big deal in China. In 2014, Forbes magazine reported that of the 10 largest companies in the world, 5 of those were Chinese state-owned enterprises, including the world's largest bank, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. You see, when the government is the primary stakeholder, they don't need general purpose financial reports because as the sole or primary shareholder, they have access to all of the internal management accounting data. And even on many publicly listed joint stock companies, party members are present on the board. So while in some countries there is a big gap between the legislature and big business, in China this is pretty tenuous. There are overlapping areas of responsibility. So during the GFC stimulus, not only did the government actually go ahead and spend its own money, but it also lent on the banks to provide credit to the state-owned entities. Remember, many of these banks are state-owned entities in themselves. The banks would lend the money to major industrial giants such as China Steel. Those industrial giants would then take the money and invest in more factories and more infrastructure. This is incredibly efficient because it means that when the government is conducting stimulus, it doesn't have to necessarily spend all of its own money. By being able to coordinate the economy, you can actually get the private business to chip in and actually get the economy back on track faster. Indeed, part of the problem here is that the state-owned enterprises with their public charter are expected to toe the line and carry out public social policy in line with the government's ideas. But herein lies the problem. Not only has this overcapacity started to push out other people out of business overseas, but it's now a case of Chinese businesses pushing out Chinese businesses. There is just simply too much supply out there. This means that a lot of these businesses are bankrupt or going close to being bankrupt. And if you can't make any money, then you can't repay the interest, let alone pay any taxes to the government. And this overcapacity is a really big deal, particularly in steel, power, and automotive. It's not just a case of being patient and waiting to get paid. You see, if you miss an interest repayment, you're in default. And if you default on a debt, that means that the bank has to go and take the money back somehow. And necessarily, that's going to involve bankruptcies. Bankruptcies are going to lead to unemployment. Unemployment is going to lead to unhappiness, and that unhappiness is going to lead to problems for the Communist Party, and that is going to lead to suffering. So in the short term, while this might mean a bunch of pain, it might also mean that China will miss its growth targets. And if you start missing growth targets, then there are officials out there that might miss their promotions. There's a lot riding on this. In the longer term, it means that you clean up the bad debts. It means that the credit that's available isn't going to feed the existing interest repayments, and it can actually go to more innovative industries as well. But at the moment, everybody's scared of the short-term pain, so they're keeping this cart going. Let's see how long it can last. There's a particular Chinese way of managing the economy here, and that's one of maintaining control. You see, a big part of maintaining the legitimacy of the Communist Party is making sure that the people always feel like they're better off under the party than they would be under any other leadership. Back in the dark days of Mao's Great Leap Forward, private property was completely abolished. But then the Great Opening happened and everything started to become a little bit more privatized. More recently, President Jiang Zemin was particularly aware that during the downfall of the USSR, that it was this rush towards a market-based system that completely changed the political landscape. People's demand for blue jeans, Coca-Cola, and change led to a hell of a lot of instability at the time. So the Chinese government has been incredibly deft at managing this change, slowly, but also doing so in a very controlled way. And for a little while, the growth was pretty easy. You needed some technology transfer, you needed to build some roads, you needed to build infrastructure, and you needed to export. And conveniently enough, the Chinese savings rate of their people is insanely high. For this entire time, it's floated between 40 and 50%. Can you imagine taking half of your pay packet pre-taxes and sticking it in the piggy bank? Well, that's exactly what the Chinese people are doing and have been doing for decades. And indeed, for a long time, Chinese consumers didn't really have much of a choice. There was only one place to put your money, and that was the state-owned banks. Interest returns were often regulated, and indeed, oftentimes they were lower than the rate of inflation. At the same time too, the stock market in China is, at the moment, still fairly underdeveloped. But it's crazy big. It's this world's second largest stock market, and it is growing in complexity as well. But for the longest time, Chinese consumers really couldn't trust the numbers. So if you can't trust the stock market because you can't trust the numbers, where are you going to put your money? It's either going to end up in banks or property. And indeed, both of those are huge. Now, this control actually has a major upside, and that is stability. You see, in the West, whenever there's a banking and financial crisis, the regulator is trying their level best to quell that fear. But in China, because party members sit on the board, the party can simply instruct all the banks to act in unison, and this quickly quells the fear. So what can China do? And unfortunately, the government's facing some pretty unpalatable options. Option number one is just ignore it and hope the problem goes away. And indeed, this worked in the 1990s where they avoided a lot of industrial reform. Essentially, they were able just to grow their problems away. That won't work anymore because, of course, we've already reached our limits here. We've already overinvested, we already have gluts, so you can't simply grow further to grow away those gluts. So you're really only left with the option of reform. Now, if you pick the option of reform, there are two ways you can go about it. You can reform quickly, or you can do it little by little. If you pick the slow option, it means extending additional credit to cover the interest repayments that should have been made on the old loan. It also means that you slowly have to shut down those loss-making industries. Now, this slow by slow approach is a very Chinese way of operating the economy. And let's face it, so far it's suited them pretty well. And the risk here is that reforms will stall and you'll end up doing nothing. And that's not really an option because you will definitely end up with an economic crash. The other option is just like a band-aid, rip it off fast. And there are two sides to this reform. Number one is banking, and number two is industrial. From a banking perspective, they're going to have to write off their bad loans. That invariably means eating into the banking assets and essentially reducing net assets. Bank capital is going to get thinner. On the industrial side, you're going to have to close down bad businesses and kill off bad projects. It means unemployment, and it means people are going to be unhappy. It might even mean civil unrest. This is pretty darn scary stuff. Now, unlike the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, or indeed the global financial crisis more recently, China's banking system does not have huge interconnections with the global financial system. So this is unlikely to end up with a global banking crisis based on a Chinese banking crisis. But here's the kicker. Where are all of Australian exports going? Without Chinese demand, we're in a lot of hot water. So in these circumstances, it wouldn't take much. A few SOEs go down, a few banks lose their capital. This becomes a banking crisis. This becomes an economic crisis for all of China, which becomes a global economic problem. This is potentially a huge problem. It's quite complex, and we won't get anywhere with oversimplifications. Let's keep an eye on China, and let's hope that their leaders can do their very best to keep things afloat. Thanks very much, Michael, for asking this question. If you have any other questions, please post them on my Facebook wall. You can tweet me, or you can leave them in the comments below. If you found this video pretty helpful and you think I've earned it, why don't you give me a like and subscribe? My name's Phillip Wong, and thanks for watching. Happy studies, guys.